Hi, everyone. My name is Irene Galea. I cover telecommunications and technology for the Globe and Mail. It's a pleasure to be with you here tonight. As we've heard over the last 2 days, Canada's North is changing. Cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure are no longer a threat of the distant future. And in order to make all of the ideas that we've heard over the last 2 days a reality in our North, we must have the critical networks and telecommunications connections in order to bring them to the ground and up to the sky. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. Eliot Pence is the founder of Dominion Dynamics, a defense firm working to build a sensor network to collect data and detect threats in the Canadian Arctic. And previously, Eliot led global growth at U.S. defense company Anduril Industries. Lyle Fabian is president of Katlo Telecommunications, an Indigenous-owned telecommunications company, and is developing IceFox, Canada's first Indigenous-led data center. Brian Gallant is CEO of Space Canada, a national organization representing Canada's space ecosystem, and was formerly Premier of New Brunswick. And Madeleine Redfern is the Northern Director of Arctic 360, a former two-term mayor of Iqaluit, and the founder and Chief Operating Officer at CanArctic Networks, which is aiming to build a subsea fiber optic cable through Canada's Northwest Passage. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. So before we get into technology and telecommunications, I'd like to talk about the threats that we're all thinking about, that we've all been talking about in little groups. What are the biggest concerns that we have related to our Arctic that we need telecommunication systems to protect us against?
For me, well, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So Dominion builds what are called command and control structures. So we think the future of every military is how do you command and control from afar? And specifically, how do you team autonomous systems with manned systems? So we're building something called Orinet. It's been deployed multiple times in the Arctic, and its principal purpose is to identify anomalies. Canada has a reservist force, the Rangers. It's over 5,000 people. We have not equipped them with technology to identify these anomalies. We have not equipped them with really any technology.
What kind of anomalies?
Well, a few years ago, we had a Chinese balloon through our land. We didn't know about it until the Americans told us about it. And then we couldn't find it until the Americans figured out how to find it. So we've got a real awareness challenge here. I think we are now clear about that, but we've got increased traffic going through the waters. We've got anomalies in the Hudson Bay. We've got challenges just operating in the Arctic. So the threat is that we don't really know. And to do that, we've got to deploy technology. We've got to work with the assets that we do have up there, and the Rangers being kind of a core piece of that.
Right. Any other threats that you think we should be talking about today?
Well, everybody's talking about China, Russia. I'm just going to say it. We have one major threat that's just south of us, right? Katlo Tech's, our number one main concern has always been about, the storage of all of our banking information, our networking information. Microsoft is going to invest, $100 million for building a new data center in Canada, but it doesn't solve the same issue and problem that we still have, is that the U.S. and Patriot and Cloud Act, United States unilaterally, without any government oversight, can gain in access to any of that information at a blink of an eye. That's a major issue that I have. It's not, my issue with, Russia and China. It's my issue of our data being stored on AWS, Google, and Microsoft, and yet these American-based companies, whether they're in Canada or United States, the Cloud Act unilaterally allows the U.S. government to
Why
to pick and choose any data.
why is that a problem?
Well, it's a problem for two reasons. They have access to all of our financial institutions' information that is probably potentially stored on these platforms. My goal, with IceFox Data Center is to unilaterally, through treaty relationships and relationships with tribal governments and First Nation governments, is protecting Canadian data and Indigenous data on treaty protected lands and utilizing both a fiber optic network and a place to store that information and still at the same time keep it out of the hands of.
Right. So we have data security issues, we have physical issues with ships entering our waters, our rising waters, balloons that we can't identify. Madeleine, anything else you can think of?
Well, I would build on what's been said, and I love the fact that the picture of Iqaluit, my hometown, is on the screen. Because when I was mayor for the city of Iqaluit, I had to school up really quickly on a wide range of issues, and including actually just our communications infrastructure, our communications services, and the fact that it is unstable, it is unreliable. Thank God for Starlink for those that can sign up on it, because that made it more affordable. But we don't have redundancy. And as such, I have many of my community members who are put at risk on a daily basis. I was just listening or saw yesterday on Facebook, RCMP once again is telling one of our communities, in this case it was, I think, Resolute Bay, that you can't access our services. If you need us, you need to come to the detachment. So what I want people to understand is that we often take for granted when we're emailing our coworkers, who happen to be at the next office, more often than not, it's actually going on the internet. And the same thing happens in our communities. They're not a mesh net sort of scenario where you're keeping, data traffic within the community. So when there is, an outage, which we experienced, I think, when I was mayor in about 2012, the whole northern part of Canada went black. And we're not just talking about the 3 territories, we're talking about also all the northern sections of the provinces went dark. There was no communication that was possible into those regions or out of those regions. Airplanes were grounded, people couldn't bank, people couldn't pay for their groceries, they couldn't pay for the gas. And I had a bit of a smirk on my face when we actually had the Rogers go down a few years ago. And I was like, see, that's what it's like. That's what it's like for us all the time. We just never know when it's going to happen. And it's extremely disruptive. Right. But also what I just want to add is that by not having, the best and most modern telecommunications infrastructure or services that is stable, reliable, and affordable, is that our businesses also are held back. So when, I just cringe every time I go into the North Mart and I see them doing their stock inventory by, stock people. Because literally you're not using all the big sort of platforms that keeps track of all your stock in real time and actually processes those like replacement orders, again in real time. And then maybe the last thing that I just want to sort of add is that I remember when a deputy minister of my territorial government sort of saying, no, we don't want fiber optic because this old technology that we're on keeps us safe from all the hackers. And I was like, are you, I was about to swear. and it's just kind of like saying, well, we got like little pebbles, to keep our property safe. And rather than the big protective, tools that are available because you're using, high speed, low redundancy, applications that actually allow those, very protective platforms, to keep your data safe. So I think it's the full spectrum from the individual to businesses to different levels of government and our national security. Because you don't have that, level of robust, high-end digital infrastructure in place, it means, as far as I'm concerned, everything is at risk.
Right. In just a minute, I want to talk about what technology we're talking about here, but Brian, do you have anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, maybe just a different point of view to add to the very thoughtful responses from my colleagues here on stage. I often would think of these types of questions, what are the challenges faced by going to the macro? And to me, the macro is what are we all facing? We're facing major threats with climate change, and we're facing major geopolitical shifts. Those two things coming together in the Arctic, we have waterways that are opening up, we have lots more interest, and we have a more uncertain world, as Aaron O'Toole did a great job moderating a discussion to sort of lay that out. So with that, it means the Arctic, we need smart infrastructure, data sovereignty, we need nation building in our north, to put it simply. And I'm from an organization that represents the Canadian space ecosystem, so obviously I think part of that smart infrastructure is ensuring that we have the space capabilities needed, sovereign space capabilities. We can discuss what that kind of means in a minute, but that's important. And nation building, the one point that I want to make sure, so I'm going to make it right off the top. I want to make sure I share this thought. One thing that one person had mentioned to me a few months ago that really resonated in a discussion on the Arctic is that, we're talking about the military functions, we're talking about the coastal lines, we're talking about all these sort of dangers, and talking about sovereign capabilities, all that good stuff. And then this person put it really simply. They said, look, one of the best ways to ensure we have sovereignty over our north is to have people living there, with a good quality of life, is having people that are able to connect and able to have good social lives, good economic opportunity, all of that good stuff. So that really resonated with me too. It's not just about ensuring there's no, ship that goes that's not supposed to. It's also about ensuring the people that are there, we're helping them, and that very much goes to the third bucket of our conversation, which is nation building.
So Canada's made it a goal to have all domain awareness. This means visibility, the ability to monitor land, sea, air, and the extra two that we're particularly concerned with, cyber, satellite. But let's be concrete for a minute. It's easy to get vague and high level in these kinds of conversations, but what communications technology actually exists today in the North?
Today, what exists in the north is, there's a fractured layer of various microwave, fiber, copper-based systems that exist throughout the Northwest Territories, all being ran by two organizations. I'm not going to say who they are, but, we all know who they are. But one of the key aspects that I've seen is that, we have this infrastructure where we have no competition. We have no said services or additional services or redundancy, or even a real true economic base that we can build, AI, data center, cloud-based technology on a fractured system that lacks redundancy. That's what exists.
So so we have limited copper networks. We have fiber. Where does the fiber reach?
Well, the fiber reaches, now there's two. So there's one, the Dempster Fiber Project, which was completed I think about a year ago, that reaches from Whitehorse all the way up to Fort McPherson, and then we have the Mackenzie Fiber Link, which goes from what is it called? It's called McGill Lake all the way up to, again, Inuvik.
Okay.
So two publicly owned infrastructures that have to plug into one supplier network, and yet we have
Bell
this,
and Northwestel?
which is Northwestel, and regardless of these two networks, they still rely on one incumbent.
Right.
And that incumbent, we have continuous outages in Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut.
Mm-hmm. And then from the air, we have satellite. What do we have in the ways of our own domestic satellite connections? I guess this is why we're here today, to discuss this, right? Okay, well, let's... Brian?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I would say is that I have members, I spoke to one this morning about something completely different, and I just mentioned where I was, and they said, well, make sure you tell them that we have capabilities, which I'm not going to do because I have 100+ members, so I'm not going to start promoting some of the members over others. But I can tell you that some of them would say what they would like to see governments do not just on this sort of opportunity / challenge, but in general, is to not always have the instinct of saying, we need to build something as a government, we need to own it, we need to send it up, we need to operate it. Maybe we bring in the private sector for some components or some steps there. They would really encourage the government to have a different shift for many reasons, which I can get into if you'd like, but essentially a shift to, look, if there is those services, if there are those services within the industry, if there is the capability, try to purchase it there. You can have different types of partnerships and all that good stuff, but essentially just enable the private sector to help you. And literally the person I spoke to this morning was like, we have capabilities that aren't used, that aren't being completely used. So please pass that on again, which I won't do. So I should probably stop mentioning it. But nevertheless, it goes to show that if we can just kind of get away from the mentality that the government has to own it all, I think we would be surprised what we could enable very quickly.
And maybe what I just want to add is a bit of a nuance is that there are not hundreds of, different satellite companies that provide service in our polar northern region. There are limitations with respect to, where the vast majority of satellites are around the equator. And there are a few companies that do provide, both a combination of either LEO and or GEO services in the north. The challenge has been, I would say is, ownership, cost, and depending on sort of, which company you're talking about, is reliability. But they're extremely expensive, in so much as that the upfront capital costs, especially now for the LEOs, is not only, quite immense, but depending on which company you're talking about, LEO satellites can last anywhere from 3 to about 5 years. There are, some companies that say that they're planning on making LEOs last 10 years. They're not in operation yet. And so as a result, it is limited. There isn't much competition. Some are, benefit from some public, investments or subsidies, and others do not. So it's not a equal playing field. Let's say that at best. But where satellites have, a value is knowing what's happening from space up until, a little bit below the marine surface, but definitely not to seabed. And so when you're talking about all domain awareness, one of the biggest gaps in our, sort of data or real-time data collection is in the marine environment.
And how do we fill that?
I'm going to pass that on to Eliot, and then and I can build on that.
I mean, the other point to note here, the providers that we do have, Starlink doesn't turn on their LEO orbit because the market isn't there for them. So even if they have some polar orbits, they don't actually turn it on. So we don't get any benefit from that. No. Telesat supposedly is going to be up in 2 or 3 years, but they've been saying that for some time. Iridium obviously is not ours. OneWeb doesn't really exist. Nope. There's basically no telcos. Like, the connectivity problem is insane. Let me just take a step back on just the role of commerce in this country. This country was effectively founded by commerce, by a company, by the Hudson Bay Company. And somewhere we figured out that we didn't like commerce. And we sort of said, actually, no, the government needs to run everything. The only way to get out of the fix that we're in right now is to leverage the private sector, is to leverage industry. And I think D&D in particular, and this prime minister recognizes that, but it's really on industry's kind of plate to say how to do that, to give the models, to tell them what to do. In the absence of that, the government is going to tell industry what to do, and that's right. Not actually going to work.
No, it never works. So you need investors at the table that are willing to work with early stage, innovators, especially with Indigenous communities where these technologies need to be implemented. And it's the people in these communities that know what they need.
Totally.
And it's, Mark Carney's not going to know what every single individual and community is going to need. And so therefore it's, investors like our investor, invested in an idea that I brought to the table. And it's those kind of investors that really bring to light, the requirement, the additional requirement, according to Hillary and her team was that, I heard her say, we're willing to invest, but you need private private investors to take up the front load of a said project. And so that's the goals that Indigenous communities need to really leverage partnerships, grassroots solutions, and solutions that actually make money.
Yeah. Brian?
I'll just take it one step further, though. There's this guy from the U.S., well, lives in the U.S., and he's right into space. Premier Ford had a fight with him at one point. I don't know if you guys, I can't remember his name. We have this impression that, he's so innovative and entrepreneurial. Harvard Business Review really had an article about a year ago or so, and it said that the first $1 billion spent by SpaceX, 90% of it came from NASA and Space Force. 90%. Every single one of us in this room, if we were told the government's going to give you $900 million to start a business and you got to find the other 100 million, you're like, well, I'm going to try. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to try.
Yeah.
So the model, I'm not saying that's the perfect model, don't get me wrong, but the idea to extend Eliot and Lyle's point, the idea that government needs to enable business, that's to what extent that happened. And if you want the background, I don't know the exact numbers, but they had like 2-3 companies NASA was working with, and there's like competitions, and then there's maybe 2 or whatever, however it rolled out, and then they picked SpaceX. And all of that started with the US saying, we need launch capabilities. We need to be sovereign with our launch capabilities. We need to be one of, if not the best in the world when it comes to launch. So we're going to be investing in it. So that's the mentality that I think we have to have. Obviously, I'd make the argument for space, but I think that mentality could apply to a few other very crucial and strategic sectors.
Brian, do you think the government should pick winners?
So, no, my members wouldn't want that, right? Because they'll say, no, we don't want them to pick winners. But that line is always sort of, it's to whittle down like the government's involvement. Can they pick winners if they say we have an open call and we're asking 10 companies to basically compete for something and they pick a winner? Sure. I think my members wouldn't mind that process. And then of those 10 companies, so I'll use the example again. I don't know the exact numbers, but there's this launch, I think it happened 2 summers ago, Intuitive Machines. If you followed it, they had this thing. They landed on the moon and they were like tilted and they had to move. And anyways, I was reading up on it. I was just fascinated by this. And NASA had a program, and they're like, again, I don't know the exact numbers, but like 10 companies started this program. They got like some seed funding from NASA. They got to like look into their innovations, et cetera, et cetera. 5 of them, let's say, then got into the next round. They got to build a prototype. Other prototypes, 3 got to continue. 2, then 1 got the contract. Not only did they get funding all the way, they got a contract. NASA had a payload on it. So it's just like complete new models of the government enabling the private sector. Again, those 2 models, maybe they work for us, maybe they don't, but I think the principle is the same, that the government can play a role in enabling the private sector, and I think we're gonna have to be a lot more forceful about it in key sectors. So to your question, I think if it's some type of program like that, yeah, they can pick winners. If it's the idea that you're just like, one day we're gonna shovel out a bunch of money to a company, maybe less so, right? It's not exactly a level playing field, but even that concept, to be fair, when you look at SpaceX, they had a bit of a competition. But at the end of the day, it was like, we need a company that's going to be able to give us the sovereign capability. We have pinpointed that we need this.
Right.
So they shoveled a lot of money at it, and the rest is history.
Okay.
So what I want to add is that for Canada, and in the Arctic in particular, is that we have decades of where government has picked winners, and more often not monopolies, or created monopolies. And not just a front-end contribution, but a never-ending, usually subsidies that come with it. And as someone who is in business and someone who's a resident, I would say is that, what ends up happening is that we end up paying the very highest price for the very worst service than anyone else in Canada, especially with respect to, more often not, telecommunications. What I do want to say is that that approach has also resulted in a legacy that makes it really hard for us true Northerners and us Indigenous Northerners to get into the game. And the other aspect is when we hear, especially, CRTC or ISET or others that are going, well, just partner. And it's like, well, I'm sorry, Bell doesn't want to partner, and they don't have to partner, and they won't partner. You know, and that's very similar to a lot of the other sort of, you know, big telecoms providers. So we are trying to get into a space where I think rightly we belong, but it is hard because, as I said, it's been gamed against us. And a few of the self-corrections that are, you know, kind of currently underway aren't enough. So being given some access to spectrum, great, but spectrum without the money or spectrum without, you know, effectively enough leverage, you know, still makes it really hard for Indigenous Northern companies to get into this space where I think, you know, we know our current providers have not been providing us good service, but I also think that they haven't been providing a good return on investment of the Canadian taxpayer money that they've been funneled for decades.
So what's one thing, if you were to go to the government and say, change this, it'll make it easier for me, what would that thing be?
Well, I think that one interesting sort of model that I can sort of speak to as a member of the Indigenous Connectivity Summit is the fact that United States, interestingly enough, has created a national Indigenous, you know, sort of spectrum supporting program, and where they have direct sort of representation and access and funds that go beyond the spectrum, and they actually have right of first refusal when there is, you know, sort of a new call for either spectrum, competition, or services. And that actually, you know, a lot of the nations, native nations down in the United States don't always know about it or take advantage of it. But that's starting to change. So when I look at places like New Zealand or even Mexico and United States and sort of go like, hey, they're doing it, we can too. One project that, you know, Kyle, and I spoke about was, you know, the value and the need of actually mapping out all the telecommunications projects that Indigenous, you know, nations or companies are doing, and not just fiber, but digital infrastructure, the data centers. I think, you know, that we have a real role to play. It shocks me that we actually have so much of our digital infrastructure is owned by foreign companies or under the control or investment, you know, majority investment by foreign companies, which means that we don't actually have true ownership and control and management of critical infrastructure. And so when you're talking about what do we need to do? Well, we need to actually do an honest assessment, and we need to map it out. We need to look at where those risks and vulnerabilities are. How do we address them and start effectively moving that way?
Yeah, moving the goalpost, you know, is a tough one for, you know, like right now the CRTC is proposing this Indigenous Broadband Fund and proposed that 2 years ago. So where is that today, right? So it's not a critical assessment of the CRTC. It's just where they're at. And so now, because of, you know, the CRTC and the Indigenous Broadband Fund, which was mirrored after the U.S. Tribal Broadband Fund, you know, which again sets aside like $300 billion for tribal communities throughout the United States to dabble in or make a strong business case to bring fiber communications, data center, you name it, they'll fund it. We don't have that model here. And so, you know, my business model was all based upon revenue generation, strong business cases, and at the same time, who's willing to invest in that. I'm not a telco, I'm not an ISP. We are a wholesale transport provider that just stores information. And basically, it's a better revenue business model case for the North, because our data centers, we can reduce HVAC systems operations 9 months out of the year, remove 2,200 tons of greenhouse gases by just operating in the North, and at the same time reduce HVAC systems 9 months of the year by 75%.
So we've jumped around a bit. We've gone satellites, fiber, mesh networks. But I want to know, do you think that the Canadian government has a coherent strategy to connect the North?
No. That's the easy answer. I mean, when you look at what our government often puts out as strategies, what I find more often than not is that they're kind of visionary statements, and there's usually some goal like by 2030, 90% of Canadians will have 30/10. And it's just like, well, that was, a goal literally that we should have had in about 2015. It was outdated by then, but it doesn't tell you how it's going to be done or who's going to do it or where it should be done and how much it's going to, cost. But I do also sort of, while I'm hearing that, there's a upcoming energy sort of strategy and development and great, my concern, especially for rural, remote, northern Arctic Canada, is you can't actually, or you shouldn't, do an energy strategy and or telecommunication strategy and or transportation strategy without all those three being considered almost simultaneously at the same time. You cannot build telecommunications infrastructure without reliable power. And most of our communities are on diesel. So that is not reliable and it's extremely expensive. And so you have to find or build an energy redundancy, which is like your own mini power station for your cable, because you don't want it to go out because our power is constantly not stable. Alternatively, too, is that when we're looking at, these business cases that where and why we should be investing in, whatever the energy solution is or the telecommunications project, is that you cannot be looking at it from merely a business case perspective of, how many households or how many residents. If you're talking about, really fulfilling the national Arctic security requirements, we're talking about protecting almost 40 million Canadians or protecting almost 400 million North Americans. So when you kind of flip the economics in that sense, as you just said, with NASA and or the military being your primary client or anchor client, the economics change quite dramatically.
That's correct.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think any economic development in the Arctic probably has to be anchored to some degree on what the CAF wants to do in the Arctic. They're going to be, in many cases, the number one customer. That is one area where the government has put a real concerted effort to transform. We're all expecting this defense industrial strategy to come out next week. In that, we anticipate a lot of the focus to be on small and medium enterprises, including the Arctic. If the CAF can play that kind of anchor customer role across energy, telco, logistics, then the economics look very, very different. And then it becomes exciting to, frankly, the biggest capital base in North America, which is Canada's pension funds, who have done, I would say, a modest amount, but who are interested and active, but they need that signal from the government, and it probably has to come from the CAF.
What would you like to see in the defense industrial strategy as it relates to telecom?
Yeah, three things. Well, as it relates to, I'll say broadly, and then maybe others can take the telco. A focus on Canadian-owned and Canadian-controlled businesses, so majority equity, Canadian, and board controlled by Canadian companies. Fast procurement, so I'm talking weeks, not years, frankly, not even months. And I actually do believe in picking winners. I think it's really critical, but it's also important that the government has winners to pick. If there is not a competent, capable, able industry player, it's hard to say, they're doing something wrong when they're not picking winners and they pick themselves, which is quite often what happens. So those three things are, I think, really critical, but I'll let others speak on telco.
What else are you looking for in the defense industrial strategy? Brian, you mentioned this.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, what I'm incredibly worried about as a Canadian, this is not in my role with Space Canada, but obviously it has a flavor to it. I'm incredibly worried that we are at a time when there are kind of cuts happening, restraint at the very least, with pretty much all departments, but defense. And defense is going to be, the big play moving forward for Canada. And what concerns me about that, I understand and support the idea behind that for sure. But what worries me immensely is the amount of dollars of our defense investments that go outside the country. And from a political point of view, in 5 years, it'll be very difficult for the government to say we've invested this much more and 75, 80% of it has gone to the US and or outside of Canada. From a developing Canada's economy, kind of restraining everything, investing in something where a bunch of those dollars go outside the country, that doesn't, I'm not an economist. I have a few classes at university that make me dangerous, but that doesn't sound good. So to me, what I would say for the industrial strategy with that backdrop, I would say when it comes to space, quantum, AI, cyber, all these things, and just pure defense capabilities, if you will, as the definition goes, and all these things, I would basically say, what do we need? What do we want to contribute and bring to the international table, to our NATO allies, et cetera? And what can we build here in Canada? Yeah. And if we can build here in Canada, we're doing it.
And
point final.
What can we build in Canada?
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff in space. There's a bunch of stuff,
what are some things for space?
Yeah, I mean, I have 65 members at our industry that all have ideas for Earth observation, that have all ideas for telecommunications, that have ideas for ensuring that we're protecting the North, and the list goes on. Well, the point being, I'll just finish. I have 4 buckets. I'll say them quickly. So one is, if we can do it in Canada, we procure it. And to your point, Eliot, we got to fix procurement for that.
Yeah.
Let me just say what we have built in this country as a refresher. Because we're buying things from foreign companies right now, from Hanwha, from TKMS, from Lockheed, from Gripen. We built the first digital fighter 70 years ago here in the world. And then we defunded it. We did nothing after that. We built the first operational drone, Bombardier's Peanut. We built the fastest cutter. We built the first autonomous AUV. We have an incredibly rich history in defense innovation in this country that we either forgot about, deliberately disinvested from. But my hope with this defense industrial strategy is Canada realizes what it has contributed to the military industrial complex and realizes that the military industrial complex is not a bad thing. It's actually how countries propel themselves forward.
That's right.
Look at the U.S., for example.
And at the same time, to get into this whole CAF deal, one of the biggest issues that Indigenous and private companies have is that, we have to pass, these exorbitant amounts of paperwork just to get secret level clearance. And, so they put a lot of roadblocks, and then they're asking for, companies like myself or companies like myself who are operating in the North are really boots on the ground, who understand the environment, understand the challenges, who live there on a daily basis, talk to the locals. We understand what we need and how to best deploy it. And yet, if we decide to, let's say we want to expand a 1,200-kilometer fiber optic network in throughout the Northwest Territories to bring redundancy, cybersecurity, hardline communications for the military, new, TV white space technology for monitoring, the North. First thing they'll say is, do you have your cybersecurity clearance? If not, well, too bad.
So the only thing I'll add is I don't want it to just lay there that it should just be Canadian companies, because the first bucket is incredibly important, because if we don't do that, and we have 70, whatever the number is, 73% of our defense dollars going to the US now, if we increase rapidly the investment in defense, it's going to be hard to even stay at 73%, let alone bring it down. So it has to be like a monumental organizational, cultural shift to be able to increase defense spending and decrease the percentage of dollars that leave the country. So bucket one, that's it. Bucket two for me is Canadian-based companies, so meaning that they are headquartered somewhere else, but they have a significant play here. That means that they are indeed building capacity in our workforce, building the centers that we need, all that kind of stuff. So,
and the relationships.
That's right, absolutely. And then the third bucket is definitely going to be companies that are outside the country, and then we need to have a robust ITB process to ensure that they're finding supply chains with SMEs to be able to play a role. And then the fourth bucket for me, this is probably the hardest one because there's so much to do in the short term from a civil service point of view and government point of view, but it's to then pick the ones that were in bucket three maybe even bucket 2, but bucket 3 especially, and say, which of these, the ones that we can't do in the country, that we want to be able to do in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Which ones? And let's pick a few. And then what do we need to do today, in a year, in 5 years, 10 years to build up that capacity so we're no longer reliant on having to go outside the country? So those would be the 4 things
I
hope
wanna-
are structured for
I'm
this
going to bring this back
strategy.
to telecom and networks. So we've talked about ground-based technology, fiber. We've talked about satellite. We haven't really talked about how these two kinds of technologies work together. How are we doing on that in Canada? Are we doing that well? What needs to be better?
Well, in the north, we're not doing that well, because everybody, I heard someone say we're in an infrastructure deficit, right? Especially for the north, we're at a $3.2 billion deficit just in telecommunication infrastructure. For us to compete on a global scale, to build, in my goal and idea is to build a pan-Arctic American network owned by Indigenous and Inuit partners, to connect both Europe through Asia. That is the ultimate goal of my dream is to really take a look at that and then reach out to the satellite providers and say, you know what, we need redundancy on these networks, and they need to be satellite-based.
But do we have the technology that we need to connect our fiber networks to satellites to get information, monitoring of our waters, climate data instantly to the ground?
So first of all, I would say that, of course, the technology exists.
That's correct.
The issue is whether or not we have, the combination of the money, or the political will and the strategy to actually, ensure that our investments, including public investments, are made in the right places. So what I would want to add is that, when we look at the north, maybe to get back to your original question. So yes, we understand that how integrated satellites and fiber is. Anyone who runs a satellite company will tell you that the very first thing you want to do is dump the data that you've collected immediately onto a ground station, onto fiber, and move it to, wherever it needs to be moved, the end user, the end reader. So we don't have enough of that in the Arctic. Thank God we've got a Nuvik and you've got a ground station, but problem is in a Nuvik, you don't have energy. So you want an energy solution in Nuvik and not $100 million, single wind turbine that doesn't really do much of anything to offset, sort of the real energy requirements that's needed there. So you've got a couple of strategic locations that can and should be fibered up, that can and should have a ground station. And, and where those locations make the most sense to bring it back is where we probably know are not only the existing economic or political hubs in our north, but also where they are going to be the military, hubs, because it makes a lot of sense to have that synergy there. So, Happy Valley Goose Bay, they closed that down. And now, of course, it's like, well, shit, we need to have that open again. And thankfully, they've got lots of energy. They don't have, the fiber that they need, the fiber that's there is very much under the control, of a single company that is not really willing to play ball with, anyone other than the government to get free money. So there, when I look at what we can and where we should do things, without a doubt, it's a fairly easy identifiable, sort of locations and what the needs are. And maybe the last thing that I would want to just add, because I know this was a question that Jessica asked last year that I couldn't answer, and I would actually conjecture no one in the country could answer, which was well, how much do we need? What would it actually take to build the energy infrastructure of, Canada 2025 in the next 50 years, or in digital or telecommunications or in transportation? There are some numbers that are floated around, but they often are not very strategic. And is it everything? No, we can't afford everything. No. But we probably could afford, some very, as I said, strategic, locations, and scale them up, because when you're trying to respond to a security threat or even a search and rescue, which is an individual security, situation. You're bringing people or planes and crews up from Trenton or Comox or Kingston, and it is hours and hours away. They're not on the ground. And in Iqaluit, I think we got 6 or funded 6 CAF personnel. And Yellowknife, I've been to their lovely Joint Task Force North building, but I don't, no disrespect, but is it somewhere probably between 50 to 100 people? It's not very big.
Nope.
So we don't actually have the boots on the ground, let alone the infrastructure that we need.
That's right.
Okay. One thing that I've been talking to people about today and yesterday is just about the daily challenges that people in the North face, whether that's telehealth, education. And someone I was speaking with yesterday asked me, well, what can we do to bring internet to these communities now? What are some quick fixes, not necessarily huge new fiber programs? Is there anything that we can do in a few months or a year to bring better connectivity to these northern communities?
Well, I might just speak for what we're doing on the mesh network side. So mesh networks are basically just simple radio frequency meshes. You can capture pretty high fidelity information. We build software that compresses that information down into small data packages that can then get sent miles across this mesh network, basically breadcrumbing itself back. That is 80-year-old technology. We're not really doing anything innovative with the exception of building software that allows us to compress the information and then routing that information. But why haven't we had the Rangers? Why don't the Rangers have this?
So these are handheld devices.
Handheld devices.
Like walkie-talkies. They interconnect using radio signals, line of
Exactly.
sight.
Yeah,
They're not connected to internet or satellite, but when they come in range, they then connect and transmit data.
Exactly. So it's basically a roving local area network. Basically.
What is the practical use of that?
Well, so when the Rangers do their patrols every other weekend, they're doing SAR missions, they're doing anomaly detection missions, they're clearing, basic infrastructure. The practical application is that they're able to capture that information. Once you capture the information and you're not taking a radio and writing it down on a notepad, you get a reservoir of data, and you can learn when you have data about, well, if we saw these anomalies or the weather was this way this time, that usually means these 3 other things happen. So you can build what are called ontologies on top of the data that allow you to do better predictive management of the areas. And, they're willing to do this. They're great clients. And we just need to leverage them more. And we need to leverage community members more as well.
That's right.
And we're sort of pushing on a completely open door. So yeah, it's about collecting data so that we can make smarter decisions, so that we can have better awareness about what's happening. That redounds to safety, it redounds to capacity building, economic development, all these sorts of things. And it's not actually new technology.
No.
Okay.
No. So a solution that we put together is a product that we call the Katlo Tech Video. Again, very similar idea. It's not new technology. It's all based on mesh wireless technology. And the only difference that we put a spin on it was the fact that we can carry around mobilized servers in the size of a Pelican case that can beam true Wi-Fi like experience over over kilometers to stream live content, like let's say a Netflix leg in the box, right? And utilizes no internet, no broadband, and yet we can take these units and devices to also push live content from city council mayors to all smart devices, and it cost me $25,000 to develop this solution that is readily available today, and we can deploy them in buses, we can deploy them in small communities, and it can beam to every single smart device within our mesh network.
So what's holding back this implementation everywhere?
a fiber project and a data center.
Okay. Brian, I just want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, domestic launch. Why do you think that that is important for Canada right now?
Yeah, it's a great question because it allows us to sort of go back in time and remind ourselves what's been happening. So a few years ago, let's say 10 years ago, I think you would have asked people in the space community in Canada, you would have asked people at D&D, and they would have said, launch, nah, that's not really a priority. We don't think we need it. It's all good. And then you'll be like, oh, why? Well, we send our stuff and we launch it from the US. We launch it from Russia. List goes on. So, that was, let's say, the response 10 years ago. Well, things have obviously shifted immensely. And you can make an argument as well, just from an economic point of view. I'll make it quickly in the sense that, look, the space sector is projected to grow exponentially. It's about $600 billion globally, an annual global sector right now. It's projected to go to about $2 trillion by 2040. So if you believe that to be true, which there's no reason to not believe that, then there's going to be immense opportunity in the space sector, and having an end-to-end capability in your country will be helpful. There'll be people that are looking to launch stuff up because there's going to be lots happening. So just that's kind of the economic. But then just from the sovereignty point of view, which I think in the last year or 2 years has really been what has caught the attention of the government here, it really is. What happens, okay, we can't launch in Russia for obvious reasons. What happens if the US kind of just decides, no, we're not doing Canada's, or we're not doing any other country's launches? Or some would argue this is sort of happening informally already. It's not a priority. You're at the end of the list. That's fine, I guess. We're all managing. But what happens when things get a little tense, or we desperately need to send something up from a military point of view, from an economic sovereignty point of view, whatever it might be, whether that be in the next year or 10. So having that sovereignty, I think, is really important. Going back to a question you asked, I think it's great. We have 3 members that are trying to develop launch capabilities, which is awesome. And people are like, is there enough volume for 3? I'm not sure there is tomorrow, but I love the fact that there's 3 that are trying to make it work. Hopefully all 3 work out, because that gives us obviously redundancy. Or maybe there's 2 of them, 1 of them that works out, and then we at least have that capability if and when we need it in the medium term.
Do you have a sense of how much it will cost to build a true domestic launch that can take the satellites we need to space?
Yeah, so the real answer is not really. I don't really have that. But what I can tell you, just to kind of get our wheels turning, look, building the capability itself, I don't think is the big investment. I mean, if there's capital, there's no question, and there's community support that's needed, so there's lots to do. But it's having, to a line that you used earlier, anchor customers, and it's to having D&D be an anchor customer. That is going to be crucial in the early days for any of these launch companies to be able to survive and make a business case for it moving forward. And again, it's not the same comparison. I'm not saying it's the right program, but they certainly build up capacity in the U.S. And look at that example I gave about how much they invested to be able to build up their launch capabilities. So it does make sense for us, I believe, to do the same thing for the reasons already mentioned. And again, I'm happy. I think it's awesome that there's 3, and maybe there'll be more, and I think that would be great as well.
I would say it's going to cost $1 billion, which, by the way, is what we just gave Canada Post to stay alive. But what you get to do with venture capital is, all you have to say is, we're going to give you $100 million. The VCs are going to give you the other $900 million, as long as the government is clear on what happens next.
Yeah.
So they really just need to provide catalytic financing, and they will get the $1 billion outcome, even if they just put in $100 million. So it's a no-brainer for me. It's crazy that we're...
It's a win-win, but we're just not there, right? So one of the things that, I've seen is, we've, again, given $1 billion to Canada Post, and then on the satellite side, we're supposed to have a $300 million investment for our own LEO technology that was supposed to be launched by 2024. It's 2026 now. And so now we throw more money at the problem, another $1 billion at the problem, and we're no near our own LEO technology in the Northwest Territories, let alone Canada. And so, and I'm asking for a measly $30 million, right? And I'm like, and we can deliver. We're boots ready. We're ground ready. We have investors. We have our construction teams ready to go. And yet, we have the solutions, the AI solutions, and it's all about, the whole discussion all has to stem back to Arctic infrastructure and smart infrastructure, data sovereignty, and nation building. And I believe that Indigenous communities have the capability of being nation builders and project leaders because what? We have the kayak, we have the snowshoe, we have the jolly jumper. These are all technologies all developed by Indigenous peoples hundreds of years ago. And then we were the ones that, built the royal family's wealth based on our fur trading capabilities, right? Our innovativeness, our tenacity, our willingness, and we went through residential school and we're still here, right? And so I think that can say Indigenous groups and communities have the ability to lead this country in the 21st century hand in hand, but Canada just needs to do it right.
Right. I'm going to open the floor to questions. Any questions?
This has been a fantastic conversation. One of the things I'd love to get a little bit more into is, so I had the real fortunate opportunity to go to Spacebound, and I don't normally find myself in a setting where I'm learning all about different space technologies and the space thing that's going on. And I think, so one of my questions goes to strategy. Maybe I think it's also my second question though is also on strategy. And so what I noticed at the conference was it was all on, obviously because it's space, but it's talking about like satellite technology being kind of the answer for the North, and because it's remote and everything. And I kept thinking, well, yeah, but we want to unremote the North. And I'm not saying anything against the satellites. What I am saying is we need them. And so my point though is like, I feel though maybe are we missing the interoperability, the kind of conversation that we need to be having that would help though drive the kind of right investments, that would help defense, where like we need all domain awareness, and that's what satellites do. And we need the technology in terms of like the kind of large space of that they're able to gather all of this stuff, and exactly what, going back to what Madeleine was saying, but then all that information needs to go somewhere. It needs to go to the source quickly and then and have fiber. And so I found like for instance at that conference there wasn't, but that's because that's the world that you're living in space. But
No pun intended. No pun intended.
no pun intended. But I feel like there's like a strategic miss there when there's not these kind of conversations about how we connect the fiber piece to the satellite thing. But there's one other thing that I was listening to also when I was learning a lot about what is going on in the space. And it is, with the robotic arm and all this kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, well, God, we need to make all these advancements in critical minerals and doing all these kind of like where these other industries are going. And I feel like, why are we not doing more of these connecting pieces where we could be more strategic? And so something that costs $50 billion for some arm doing whatever it is in the moon, but yeah, we could also be using that for like these really good technologies also. And so there's kind of cross-sectoral things. And I feel like, are we missing some sort of piece that is bringing these conversations together?
I'll start off with a very general comment. I think she referenced Spacebound, so that's our annual conference, October 20th, 21st, by the way, so you're all invited. In Ottawa, I'll pick you up at the airport if you come. So one thing that's really interesting, I joined the space sector 4 years ago now. And when I got into it, I was just super curious as to what the issues were, opportunities, challenges, and I was fascinated. And I had in my career, to that point, had the immense privilege of being briefed by experts and meeting all these incredible people and seeing these incredible industries. And I didn't know all the stuff that was happening in space. And that really struck me. So I think to answer a part of your kind of, the ethos of your question, I think the space community is so keen to let people know what it can do. And I think this room is more informed than the vast majority of the rooms that I've been in, so that's great. But they're so keen to allow to have opportunities to explain why space is important to our economic sovereignty, the economic opportunity to fight climate change, to bring digital connectivity. The list goes on. So to your point, when we have a conference, there's no question it's a lot like we're important and there's all these things happening and opportunity. But I think to your point, absolutely, we need to start to get space into different conversations and find ways for cross collaboration more so than. And I really like what you said. I think it applies to space as well. By the way, when you're kind of, I forgot the exact examples you gave, but you're like transportation, energy, like all these things. If you have it, they have to be done in the same time. Space is at the heart of so many things, right? Like the space capabilities is not like one sector that it touches. It really touches all of them to a degree. Many of them, they're at the heart of it. So I think cross-pollination is going to be incredibly important moving forward for sure.
Maybe, what I do want to add is that what I have found also somewhat problematic, and I'm not anti-space because I absolutely think that, there's immense value in what is happening in space as long as it's done responsibly. But it bothers me fundamentally when I hear, even including the former CRTC commissioner, in a podcast say that we can't afford, fiber to the igloo. And one is incredibly racist. Two, it fails to understand that there are strategic areas in which fiber is needed in the Arctic. Yeah. And also, just maybe to correct you, Jessica, is that satellite cannot do all domain awareness. It does not do subsea marine domain awareness or under ice persistence. So, again, maybe just that as I think about, where we are and where we need to be, and looking at, that word smart infrastructure. So some of those smart solutions are small and beautiful and within our communities. Some of it's really big and necessary and multi-purpose. Someone said, yesterday about, it needs to be more than dual purpose. And, when I look at our north and what it can be and should be, for not only those that live in the north, but for our country, is that we have no shortage of innovation. We have no shortage, of understanding what the potential solutions are if we are working together as industry, different levels of government, Indigenous peoples, and business sector, to figure it out. It's just a question of, this really vast country is too siloed. We're often talking in isolation on single issues or single topics instead of sort of like, coming together and saying, okay, what do we have and what do we need and how are we going to get there?
Yeah.
Like we are on this stage, right?
That's right.
There you go.
There we go.
That's right. The only, to touch on the whole space thing, I guess, the only thing that I learned about, the work that you do is through Eagle Flight Networks. I'm pretty sure that, Scott Brandt is, probably has really latched on to this whole space. And my wife says, and I was telling her about this, and she said, the only space that you should be worrying about now is how much space we have in the cupboard. So,
Right.
There you go.
Well, it's a great place to end it for today. Thank you so much, everyone.
That's awesome.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a good job. Nice job, man.
Yeah.